Hello everyone, Mindy Beverly with you here today with Kindred stamps for our virtual retreat. In this video, we are going to be coloring up these super adorable little duck couple here. I'm going to be showing you how to color these cuties up with Copic markers. And let's go ahead and get started. So in your kit, you have the stamp set here, the Park Pal stamp set. And you're going to want to stamp out those two little duck characters right here, and I just colored them or stamped them onto a blending cardstock. This is Express It blending cardstock, but any kind of blending cardstock will do. We are going to go ahead and start coloring up, and with them, since I have here, you can see they have their little white feathers and then darker tones. When I'm doing little images like this, I always start with the lightest colors first. So that's why we're going to be starting the feathers first on both images. So for this, I'm going to start off with C7. And I'm going to go through and just color up the fur feather areas and add a few more little details. So right here, I'm going to pull these little feathers here, just flicking those towards the center, extending the lines that are already there just slightly. I'm just pulling any shadowed areas with C7. So like underneath the hat here, by the side of the little beak, and along this right edge, because if we have the light hitting from this upper area, upper left, then we're going to have more of a shadow on this right side. So here by the top of his beak, just pulling with the tip of the marker down along that right side, my right side, his left. And then here too, underneath this portion. And we're just placing in our little shadow areas to start. And I'm not connecting those two areas. You don't want full solid lines around everything. So just like that. And then here on his little tail feathers, I'm going to extend these little lines that are drawn there just slightly. Just like that. And then again, pulling underneath his shirt, a shadow line. And then on the opposite side. And then along this bottom edge. Just like that. And then you also have his little hand here. We're going to make sure we add the shadow where his shirt is overlapped, and then barely along this bottom edge, and then that top little part, and then same thing on his other little hand, which is kind of just a little dot since it's such a small little area. Now we're going to do the exact same thing for our little girl here. And again, just extend those little lines just slightly, and then pull that shadow through. So like underneath this little bow, you're going to have a shadow. And then she has some little hair pieces that stick out here. So again, I'm going to extend these little lines towards the bottom of her head there, and then also that little line. And then pulling shadow from the side of her beak up to that hairline, because that's going to be more in shadow there. And if you go outside the lines there, don't worry, we're going to be fussy cutting that out. Or if you did the cut files, we can just use a little gel pen to clean that edge up. So again, just pulling that color around the side there, going underneath the bow, and then pulling that shadow slightly around, but still leaving where the highlight is without that darker shadow. Here too, where her little beak is. And then same thing on her little arm. So she has a bracelet here. So we're going to want to pull the shadow here where her little short sleeve top is. And then you're also going to have a small shadow underneath her bracelet. Just like that. And then same thing here on this little hand. Going along this bottom edge. and then her legs. Whoops. And I accidentally added the shadow there, but that's okay. It will still blend in with the rest of when we do that part orange. So if you did not do that already, skip that part. You're going to do the shadow here at the bottom of her feathers. And then we'll fix that orange area in just a second. So there underneath her shirt. Just like that. And that was with C7. And now really quick, I'm going to fix that little shoe area, so her leg there, so I don't keep coloring it the wrong color. So I'm going to grab my YR04, and I'm just going to quickly add the shadows into where this little leg is. Since that's a cool gray, it's still going to go just fine for the shadow of where her shoe is. So it won't really matter. So just like that. And we can color map out this too. So while I have this color, I'm going to pull the shadow where the little feet are here, just around that bottom edge. And same thing here. Okay. So now I'm going to move on to C5. And I'm just going to smooth out some of these little shadow lines. I'm going to blend them up towards the white section, but still coloring more on the tip of the marker. I don't want to extend this too far because I want these areas to still read as white, but you're still going to have the shadow blending at the edges. So again, pulling that color around. Just like that. And then here too, at the bottom of these little feathers. Adding that little shadows, and then on our little boy here. Pulling that shadow underneath his little shirt. And then along his hand. And then here along these edges. And same thing on this opposite side. And then don't forget the little top feathers here. There we go. And I almost forgot her little arm. And his hands. And again, that was with C5. And now I'm going to move on to C3. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to pull those shadows, blend them out just slightly. And I'm really not extending this color very far into the rest of the coloring. I'm just pulling the rest of those edges. And then following through in all of those white areas. Oops, and then she also has this area too that should be the little V part of her shirt, so it's going to show her feathers through that. And then do the same thing on our little boy here. Pulling that shadow around, coloring more on the side of the marker. And then in the delicate areas, just going with the very point of the marker. Just like that. Okay, I'm going to grab my C7 one last time because I forgot to add the little shadow here on our girl. So there we go, there's the dot of that shadow. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to C1. right here. And this is where we're going to start doing some flicking with our marker. So I'm going to turn this to the side and I'm going to flick away from myself. So I'm going to start here where the shadow area is and then flick towards the center, just like that. And you're going to build up your color, and I'm going to just go all the way around. And the smaller the area, the smaller the flicks you'll do. And if you need it blended out more from the previous color, you can always go back over it. So again, just pulling this color towards the center. It's going to look a little bit gray right now, but once we add in all of our other colors, it's going to read as white with the shadows. So again, pulling that same color, starting from the edge of your shadows and then flicking it towards the center. And do whatever is more comfortable for you. Flicking away from myself is easier and I can get more of a darker to lighter blend doing that. So that's why I'm turning the page as I go. So I'm not fighting against my own hand trying to get the variation of color. Okay, so then same thing on the rest of the little feather areas. And again, these ones are so small, you're kind of more coloring along the side of your marker because you still want to have some white highlights there. You don't want to cover them all with the C1, the whole section. So you can see I'm mostly concentrating on the edges and leaving more of the center area as the white of the paper. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing for our little boy duck here. And again, just pulling that color to the center, exactly like we did for the girl. And again, just following through multiple times if I have to make that transition of the previous color to the lighter color more gradual. And then here too. Going over those areas a couple of times to build that color blend. Okay, and then same thing here on the bottom part of his little tail feathers. Mostly focusing on the right and left sides, but still pulling a small line of that C1 underneath his little shirt there. And then on his hand, focusing more on the bottom portion. Do a little bit more shading on the sides of his face there. Just like that. Okay, so now you can take, if you have your colorless blender, your 0, I like to feather out the edges of my previous C1. So I'll usually just take this and just go over my white highlight area and barely hit into the edges, and it will soften those previous feathered edges a little bit more. This is not necessary if you don't have a colorless blender. You could have just left it as is. You can see it doesn't do much, but it does soften those little edges just slightly. All right. And now I'm going to take my RV000 and I'm going to add a little bit of color to the color to the cheeks of our girl and boy here. So I'm just going to flick this color in the center of these little curves, but on the back part of the beak, just like that. And this is with RV000. I'm going over a couple of times. And then I'm going to take my RV10, I'm going to build up this color. So again, just going over those areas. And then last but not least, I'm going to use RV21 to just go right along that corner edge. Just like that. And same thing on our little boy here. And then I'm going to take my RV000 one last time. And I'm just going to fan out this edge one final time. Okay. And now we can move on. We'll finish coloring the beaks and the little legs here. So we did the YR04 down there on the feet. We're going to finish doing that with the beaks. So we're going to take that YR04 one more time. And I'm going to pull all the shadow areas. So like the inside of the beak here on both of them. And then pulling that shadow along the edges here, this right, or my right side, her left. And then barely along the top part of the beak. And on this bottom part. And I'm really coloring on the tip of the marker here so that I don't get too much color, because I will still want that to read as yellow and not orange when we're all done. And then along this bottom edge of this beak, just like that. I'm going to add that a little bit more orange there to her feet. And then also her bracelet, we want this to read kind of as gold, so I'm just going to add a dot of this to the top and bottom side. And then same thing for our little boy here. I'm going to finish pulling those same colors on the beak exactly like we did for the girl. So pulling around the edges, along the top part, right here on this upper beak area, and then along the bottom part of the beak. And then I'm going to take my Y17 and I'm going to extend these areas. So just like before, I'm going to pull this color on either side. And same thing here. I'm going to finish going around the beak and then blending into that previous shadow color. This is going to help smooth out those areas. Pull along the bottom side of the beak and around. Here too on this upper portion of the beak, and then the inside of their little mouths there. And then same thing on this girl. We're going to just do exactly like we did for the boy. So pulling this shadow around the edge and then underneath, and then again here on this upper portion of the beak, and then on the inside of the beak on her feet here. And then just a dot on either side. We still have a highlight in the middle of her little bracelet there. And then here on the top part of his little feet, I'm just going to add just a tiny little line. Oh, and then his little buttons here, those will have a little dot of this yellow color, and then the stripes on his little shirt we'll have those 2 dots as well. And then we forgot to do the orange in there, so I'm grabbing my YR04 one last time, and I'm just going to add a tiny dot to the top and bottom, or in the bottoms of the buttons, so that we still have that color difference. Okay, so now we're going to move on to Y06. And just like before, we're going to go over these same areas, extending this color a little bit further, but still keeping the white of the paper there for your highlights. We're going to finish coloring in the mouths there on the inside of the beak. A dot for the buttons, a dot on either side of your little ribbon trim, and then pulling this color across that same area, extending it a bit further on the feet. A dot on either side of her bracelet, and then blending out the beak just like we did for the other character, and pulling this through, but still leaving a small highlight there. Okay, and now we're going to move on to Y00. And here we're going to finish blending this out, but still leave some highlight. Here too. And this is more just softening these little highlight areas. So pulling from either side, but still leaving that main white of the paper there through that center area. So just like that. And then last but not least, for this to give some texture to these little critters here, we're going to be using YR04 one last time. And I'm going to just do some small, tiny little texture dots at the top of the beak here. And just randomly place those in. Same thing with our little girl. And I'm going to do a couple here in their mouth area. And with our little boy. And then on the bottom of their little feet, their little, right above the shoe line too. Just like that. Now if you had any areas where you went out of the lines just slightly, you can take your white gel pen, and I just clean it up by just going right over it like that. You want to wait until it's dry, but then it'll easily go over those areas. And I can break up some of this darker line where I had that little accident there. You can just smooth that out. I put like a little dot and then a white line, and it'll look more like just like a shadow. And then at the top of the beaks I can add a highlight, which is a line and a dot, and a line and a dot, and then maybe a couple of dots in their mouth there. Okay, so now we can move on to the inside of their tongue. I'm going to be taking RV04, and this is the darkest for our pink color, and I'm just going to just dab along this right edge of their little tongue there, and then I'm going to finish coloring the areas that are pink of our girl here. So we have her little pink bow. I'm going to pull all of the little shadow lines that are already there of this ribbon, pull it along this right edge, same thing there, and then pull it along that top. I'm going to extend this line for this top part of the bow, same thing on the opposite side, just like that. And then I'm also going to add just a couple of little dots here so that the ribbon looks like it's going to be sparkly a little bit. Okay, and now I'm going to do the same thing with her shoes. I'm just going to pull our shadow line along the bottom of these little high heels. And then same thing on this opposite shoe. And then pull our shadow along the top of that to blend it. I went ahead and put some of that pink through that gray so that it blends it into the shoe. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to RV21. And I'm just going to do a dot right there on their little tongue up towards the top part of their beak. And then I'm going to go through the shadows and extend them a little bit further like we did before. Pulling those lines, and then same on her little bow. Pulling that color around, but still leaving some white of the paper. And I'm going to move on to RV10. And then just like before, go through those shadowed areas, extending it slightly further. Just like that. And then to finish off, I'm going to be using RV000. And again, still leaving some white of the paper, but making just a tiny little lighter area there. And still blending out the sections even further. And then I can take my RV04 and just add a couple of little dots that I didn't do to the bottom of her shoe. I forgot to do, so I'm just going to add them in now, just a couple. I'm going to add a couple more to the center of this bow, just like that. And then I'm going to take my gel pen and I'm going to add a few little highlights to the shoes and to the bow, just a couple of little dots or a line and a dot. And then if you had any areas like here, I went out just a little bit out of the lines, I'm just going to clean that up with the gel pen. And there we go. So now we have our super cute little girl's shoes and bow done. Okay, so now we can move on to her top. So for this, I'm going to start off with V09. And I'm going to go through along the edges here and pull our shadows. Just like this. And then same thing on the top of her little shirt. Make sure I add a couple of those little texture dots now to those shadow edges. This is just something I like to do. It's not completely necessary. I just like the extra details that it adds. And now I'm going to move on to V06. I'm just going to go over those areas, extending that shading a little bit further. Same thing on her little shirt, sleeves. And now we're going to move on to V04. And I'm just going to flick this color in towards the center, still leaving some white highlight in the middle. I'm going to do a little bit less shading there on her arms, but still leaving those lighter highlights. And then I'm going to take my V01 and I'm going to finish blending out this color, but still leaving a small little white highlight. You can see right there in the center of her shirt. And I'm going to do the same thing on either sleeve. And you can go over a couple of times if you need to blend it down, make that color blend out. And then I'm going to take my V04, which was my color right before the lightest color, and I'm going to just go over these previous little dots and add a few more. So you have at least 2 colors of these dots, so they look more like her little shirt is sparkly. And then I can take my gel pen one last time and finish adding some little highlights to her top. So a few areas I'm adding a little line and a dot, and then I'm going to add a couple of just little sparkle dots over mostly just the shadowed area. And now you can see we are all done with our little girl, all colored up and ready to go on our album. Now we're going to finish our boy. And we're going to go ahead and do the red bow first. So I'm going to start with R59. And I'm just going to, just like we did on her little bow, just follow the shadowed areas. Just like that. Adding just a couple of little dots there. Then I'm going to move on to R29. And I'm just going to barely add a dot shadow underneath his beak and then along this bottom edge. And just a dot on that center of the bow. I'm going to move on to R35. And again, just extending those shadowed lines slightly more, but still leaving a tiny bit of white highlight. R22. And I know this is a lot of colors for a small area, but it really does make a difference in your shading. And then to finish off, I'm going to be using R11. And this, I'm just going to dot right over it, so that it still will leave some areas with the white highlight, but when it's such a small area, it's easiest to just dot instead of actually blending that color out. So there we go. Now his little bow is all done. Now we are going to do the blue area. I'm going to start first with the shadows, B29. And we're just going to pull the darkest shadows like we did before. So anywhere there's cloth overlapped, like this little bow is overlapped over this top, you're going to have that shadow. The underneath part of his arm, and then along both sides, just like that. Pull the shadow a little bit further, but not connect it. And then here on his little hat, I'm going to pull the shadow along this side here, extending that little line just barely. And then of course where the hair is overlapped, and then the top band of his little hat. And then I'm going to move on to B05. And again, just going over my previous shading, extending the lines a little bit further, following through on the side of the marker. Just like that, and then on his little arm, and the opposite arm, and then the sides of his little shirt. Just like that. And then I'm going to move on to B12. And then same thing as before, we're just going through this color lineup to blend it out. Following all of my little edges there and extending them a little bit further towards the center. There we go. I'm going to add a little bit more shading there to the top of his hat. That's better. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to B00. And just like before, we are going to pull that color through, but still not connecting it yet. And then same thing on his hat. Still leaving the white of the paper. And then we're going to use BG000 or BG0000. And this is where we're going to finish coloring in these areas. On these darker colors, I don't usually leave it totally white. I'll blend it out with a really light color. So I'm just going over that highlight area. I'm cleaning off my marker in between each section so I don't accidentally transfer darker color right through the middle of our lightest areas. And then I'll just take my B05 one last time, and like I did with the girl, I'm just going to add a couple of little texture dots along the edges to break up some of the shadow line, but also to add just a little bit more detail. And then here too, just like that. Okay, and then last but not least, we just have his little ribbon on his hat. I'm going to do that with 100 to start. And again, this is just pull our little detail line of the ribbon. And then here too, along this bottom edge of either side. And then moving on to C7. And on small little ribbons like this, I'm really just going to blend from either side and then keep moving towards the center of that section. And then C5. And again, shading from the right and left side towards the center, still leaving that small highlight. And the same thing on that ribbon. And then I'm going to jump right to C1 instead of C3. And we are just going to pull the last part of this towards the highlight. And I still have it go to white with this. So I'm just barely dabbing. If I get into a spot like this ribbon where it's really small, I'm just dotting it until it looks like a good blend. So same thing here, just add a few dots. And then we can take our gel pen and add our final finishing details, highlights. So I'm just going to add a small little highlights there, couple to the little cheek area, and then on the side of his little top, I'm doing like a line, dot, and then a few little highlights along the ribbon here, the bow. And there we go. Now we have these cuties all colored up and ready to put on our album. Alright guys, I will see you for part 1 of the construction of our album in the next video. Bye!